You have met our panel members, of course, already through the presentations earlier. So we're going to get straight down to business. And in fact, thank you very much, by the way, for the questions that have come in so far. Do keep them coming. That's fine. We can take them right up to the end of the session, of course. But in one respect, Brett, it gives us an opportunity to clear something up, because we've had a couple of questions to the same effect, which is just to explain, you referred to one of the areas you look at for integrity as transfers of allegiance. Not clear to everyone exactly what that is, so a quick clear up there, thank you.
Okay, apologies for assuming that knowledge, which I shouldn't have. Transfers of allegiance is the process by which an athlete goes from representing one country to representing another. So it's an integrity issue in athletics, because sometimes it happens due to backhanders, bungs, fraudulent means, and it has to be closely regulated. There are rules around it that we have to ensure are conducted with integrity.
So an issue for athletics, certainly, not for racing particularly. Okay, thanks for clearing that up. Look, Jack, I'm going to start with you, because you gave us the springboard for all of this in any case. And there is one very clear message, it seems to me, from what you're saying, is whatever you do and however comprehensive your integrity unit, you cannot stop a cheat.
With sport and with sports people, they're competitive. You know, inherently, that's the whole idea of it. So they will, as even Anna Marie has admitted, push it to the boundaries, push it to the limits. But as regulators, what you can do is cut down on the opportunities to cheat through the rules, etc. And then when you do catch people, then the sanctions should act as a deterrent. So that's the way it goes. But it's difficult, because sport is full of silly rules, you know, but, and excuse my grammar, them's the rules. You know, they are the rules, and that's what you're supposed to abide by. And even currently in the UK, if you like, the big sports story is Manchester City and this financial fair play.
Yeah.
For outsiders, you broke the rules, you served the penalty. For them, they are questioning the very fairness of the rules. And that's a typical example of what you're dealing with.
Nonetheless, when you say, you know, the way in which you can apply rules and make them fix, I mean, there are those who will say rules will be broken, but do sanctions really make a difference? Does the tightening up make a difference? So we can talk about whether it's, again, in athletics, have a lifetime ban, that'll stop them. It's now a 4-year ban. Is there any evidence to say it does make a difference?
Well, you have to make a difference is the answer to that question. Because if you don't, for example, with doping, then do you want just a free-for-all, and then the health of athletes is compromised? You know, in effect, you coerce all athletes to have to take this. But it is a difficult one, you know. So, for example, with, give you just one example, 2012 London Olympics, we're almost near 100 medals having to have given back because of the retrospective testing. So that's 100 of those medals haven't been given back. And I think with Russia now and Sochi, Russia was on the top of the medal table, but now, again, because of retrospective testing, it's been taken off. You know, so the battle is after the finish line with this as well.
So that, Brett, is what I wonder you and the likes of Anna Marie are up against, is a belief that it makes a difference. And you can have an integrity unit, and you can have lots of resource, and you can have independence, as you've referred to. You've still got to, A, have the power to make your recommendations work, and you've got to have the belief of all those within the organization that it does make a difference. And that's really difficult. Can you measure it? Could you measure it in racing, in AFL, in athletics very clearly?
Well, yes, I believe we can. I mean, first of all, as a general comment, in our observation, the motivation of cheats, and Jack discussed this very well in his talk. You'd certainly have, like any organised crime when it comes to doping, people are motivated by money, the opportunity to make money. They weigh up it's just a straight calculation of the chance of getting caught, the penalty versus the possible benefit. So our job, first of all, is to make that equation as favourable as possible to integrity. And throughout my career, racing, Australian football and athletics, what I can see is if their enforcement isn't strong enough, the pool of people who are willing to cheat or almost coerced into cheat just grows and grows and grows and grows. And you can get really crazy situations where cheating becomes the norm, like you had with the peloton, like you had with international cricket. You know, I always remember the story about Hansi Cronje and the South African team. There was a situation there where the captain went to the entire South African team and said, hey, we've been offered $300,000 US to throw this match. We should only do it, though, if everyone votes yes. And 9 voted yes and 2 voted no. And so they didn't do it. But then that didn't come out until years later. But that was the extent of which cheating was normalised. So really, I see a huge part of our job. It's really hard to go to athletes and ask them to be honest, to compete truly, to compete fairly, if we're not doing anything to actually catch cheats. That's what we owe them.
Anna-Marie, would you share that? Or?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I wouldn't go quite as far as Jack sort of said that, you know, we can't stop people from cheating. I think we can. I think that it's much more complex than that. There are people who cheat because, in safeguarding, you call them situational offenders, because of the situation they're in, because they feel isolated, because they don't have the support, because they're vulnerable, because whatever, you know, because they need money. They will be tempted and be more likely to cheat. And those people may not, in any other circumstance, cheat. They may consider themselves to be really, you know, have great integrity in every other aspect of their life. So I think there's a huge amount of work that we can do to create the right environment, to make sure that we're supporting people who are vulnerable to be tempted to cheat or being coerced into cheating, which is a bit like you're saying, you know, let's try and recognise those situations, to put a lid on it. There are always people who are going to cheat and who are going to try and get around it, and you can never stop those people. You can only catch them, but we can make a lot of difference by educating people and helping to create the right environment. But, you know, in terms of sanctions, it's hard to say, because I think the sanction will be different for everybody, and it will depend on the risk and the reward. You know, you're measuring these things up. One of the things that I used to find as an athlete was I didn't want somebody to be racing against me who had previously served time out for doping, unless I knew that they'd actually had served long enough out that they never still had any benefit from that doping. If you've taken steroids 18 months ago, and then you carry on training, having a year's suspension or even 2 years suspension, you know, in 2 years' time, you can still be benefiting because you'll have trained through, you still have that. So it's worth the risk, and it's worth taking time out. That's not going to deter anyone. But, you know, we've got human rights, and we've got all sorts of legislation we have to deal with. It's really hard to give people the sanctions we really need to.
Stuff that gets in the way of integrity, almost.
Yeah.
Ray, you gave us a whole litany of examples of scandals, which some perhaps you felt were not anywhere near as scandalous as they were portrayed. Nonetheless, it seemed to show to me that from start to finish through your career, the scandals are there, the cheating's going on, and there wasn't much to suggest that whatever efforts have been done within racing in terms of integrity, they're having much impact on level or scale.
I wouldn't agree, David. I think to make that assertion on the basis that some cheats over a period of 10 or 20 years, as we were dealing with there, have been caught, doesn't besmirch the reputation of the hundreds and thousands of people involved, of the hundreds and thousands of races that have been conducted fairly. I mean, if we didn't get an odd cheat, we wouldn't have had our job, David. I'd take a more optimistic view. I think along the way, racing has refined processes to try and become more efficient. I was fortunate enough to be included on a panel that just recently, for the Department of Sport, the Commonwealth Government in Australia, to do a review of sporting integrity. We've just made some far-reaching recommendations that have been adopted, bringing in a sporting commission, bringing in an independent tribunal for sports, being a signatory to the Macallan Convention. Sports are rapidly catching up because what's changed in the landscape for the sports is now the incentive of betting and betting exchanges. So we've been dealing with betting and problems in racing for 150 odd years, and Anne-Marie, how many years earlier in the UK where racing, certainly Australian racing, was founded. So I'd take a more optimistic view. If we weren't catching anyone, would you say, well, you're pretty hopeless of what you're doing, why do you bother?
And that's an intriguing sort of dilemma in a way, isn't it? Because you're creating integrity units to find what's wrong with your sport, and of course the likes of Leo are going to certainly report on what is the bad news. That has to be obviously a long-term risk worth taking, Brett.
Yeah, I wish all journalists were as thoughtful in their the way they write and present things as Leo, but certainly it's a short-term pain versus long-term gain factor. One thing, I think transparency in being proactive in reporting our own cases, charges is very important, because it shows that we're not hiding from this. And hopefully, in the case of the sport of athletics, the dollar will start to drop that, hey, these guys are actually doing the right thing. Just the fact that they're announcing cases isn't bad news. It means that they're actually doing something about it.
Is that, Leo, how you think integrity units are perceived amongst journalists? I don't want to lump all journalists into one, but that integrity units must be a good thing, or potentially they're not such a good thing because they want to control the information, the way it comes out, perhaps what's going wrong, and stay in charge. I mean, it's not necessarily, as Ray said, he's not the biggest fan of complete transparency, for example. You are, because you're a journalist, you want access to everything.
It comes down to that information flow and how it comes across, and the quality of that information. And once journalists have an understanding of that, they can then go forward. And I think that they're likely to be far more positive to organisations that are proactive in that way. And I think one of the things that general commentary about Victorian racing anecdotally over the past probably year or so, the general commentary from the trainers there, that it's never been easier to win a race in Victoria, whereas probably a year or so ago more, it was far tougher. And that's because of the changes that have occurred in terms of the cases that have been prosecuted.
One comment I wanted to make was just on the issue of measuring the success of stopping cheating. And I think it's a really important thing for integrity units to be able to do. So, for example, in athletics, if we want to measure the success in preventing doping, we can, and we have captured the decrease in blood hemoglobin levels at the starting line of major marathons in the last decade because of testing efforts, and there's a clear downward trend. Even though, you know, if we're doing a good job, we'll in fact have more cases. Cases isn't the measure, but these broad statistical things can be. So in racing, it might be TCO2 levels, it might be the spread of trainers winning races, etc. But we need to look for this data to be able to prove things are working.
Really tough to persuade the public that 100 medalists in the London Olympics were cheats, and the fact you found out years later is a positive thing.
No, I totally agree with that. The retrospective testing needs to be done as a deterrent, but our approach is 100%. We don't want to be relying on that, because that's the last resort. We need to be, and we're totally focused on catching people who are cheating today.
So let's just come back a little bit to you, Leo, if I could, because we've talked a bit about the tensions inevitably between journalists and regulators, between a sport and the press, if you like. I mean, what are you? What are you? You said you love racing. Seems like you're also a crusader for stories that are going to pick apart aspects of racing. Are you looking for bad news stories?
No, but they emerge. And I guess the information that you receive, and that can be from integrity units or authorities, is something that you pursue. As someone who covered the Tour de France for many years, to see the way that that race has been totally wrecked by cheats over the years, it influences your value system. And coming back to racing 3 years ago, the very first day I went to the races in this new role was the day that the Aquanita scandal started. So from there, it's not so much a crusade, but the pursuit of news. And as I said in the presentation, the best single race I've seen in generation for a long time was Alligator Blood and Catalyst at Flemington last Saturday. That was just a pure sporting contest. And it was very healthy to see that, given what had happened in Australian racing over the past couple of years. And I think the investigators deserve all the credit in the world for rooting those kind of people out that they have so far.
But when you're examining a story like that, or any others, and you turn to Ray, for example, and say, look, hang on, you've got to help me here, where do Ray's comments fit in your sort of scale of dependability? I don't mean Ray particularly, but do you read it as and take it at face value, or is there a part of you that thinks, well, you know, there's a bit of a smoke screen inevitably going on here? How do you view them?
It's all down to communication, and it goes both ways. And there have been situations where there's an awareness of a certain case, certain bits of evidence, and if the regulator says to you, listen, this is premature, we'd prefer it if you sat on it, because with what you have right now, there's a very good chance you'll be wrong, or only partially right, which is just as bad. Best off to sit on it. And typically, that always ends well. And as Ray said in his presentation, just make sure you don't leave the journalist out who actually abided by that in the first place. So it's all down to communication.
Okay. And I think it's also building a relationship, having that trust and relationship between the regulator and the media, because it works both ways. The media can really help investigations at the right time by telling a little bit, exposing a little bit of a story, and then you'll get other people who'll come forward who wouldn't necessarily have stuck their head above the parapet if there wasn't somebody else who's sort of disclosed something or blown the whistle.
So let me ask in the other way, in a sense, when huge sporting scandals tend to erupt, they tend to erupt courtesy of journalists, possibly via whistleblowers, and they're usually accompanied by outrage from the sport at the allegations that are being made until it proves indeed that was the case, and then we go on another journey there. So is that changing? I mean, is there a greater acceptance of whistleblowers? Because we say there is, but I'm not sure we always get the evidence for that. Do you have a view?
Yeah, it's really difficult. Whistleblowing is really difficult, not just for sport, but in business as well. It's difficult. But it's so vitally important. So, for example, in athletics, we've had certain Russian whistleblowers who were key to all of this. But it's like a protected disclosure, that when someone gives the information, it's what's done with that information and the impact that it'll have on them, which is difficult. And sport hasn't done very well with that. And it's going to be even more important as we go along, because exactly as Brett said, we've moved away from hard testing and we're into intelligence side of it. So how sport deals with that in the future is going to be extremely important.
Ray, how does racing deal with whistleblowing? How welcoming are you?
I think that's an area of improvement, but David, listening to what you said, I think there's two halves of it. There's whistleblowers and there's, we used to call it racetrack scuttle. And for every 100 inquiries I've had from journalists, is there anything truth in the fact that so-and-so's got a positive in the Doncaster? I'd say 95 to 98% of those are wrong. And if you've got a good rapport, as Leo says, you can stop it there. For the other 3 or 4%, you might want to say, well, look, don't write that. There's something important happen. We might have some surveillance going. We might have a whole range of things in. And if you can delay that and say, you hang on to that, But the day that you can say something, as we've both agreed, don't leave him out in the cold, or next time he's not going to make the phone call, David.
Yeah, obviously that relationship's really important. It brings us on to actually one of the questions I've got here from the floor, which is simple and to the point, but how should regulators be paid? By the sport, by government, by the betting operators? Who should pay to maximise the trust in the regulators effectively? All or any?
I think it should. I think probably it should be a mix of those that are being regulated plus some independent funding. I mean, ideally direct government funding, or however that the sport is funded. The independence of funding is actually, I think, is quite critical to allow the regulator to have some really sort of core operational things going on. But you also have to, as a sport and as a person being regulated, buy into it. You have to believe in it, and you have to have... What you don't want to have, though, is them to be able to control what you're doing by not paying you or by cutting off the funding. So there's a really fine balance, I think, about it. You certainly don't want commercial companies and sponsors delivering that money, I think, because that really would be manipulative.
Can I just say, David, I think, particularly in Australia, most of the regulators are employed nowadays by statutory bodies of government, and funding will come off the first charge of the TAB or whatever. I think the word of warning, I hope you're joking when you said that the betting operator should be paying the regulatory people, but...
I don't think it was a joke, and whether they should be contributing.
Oh, well, contributing in the pie, but not directly or reliant upon a handout from a betting company. But the other matter that, where the word of caution I would apply is that you've got to be careful that you separate the regulatory side from the commercial side of a body, because quite often they've got very diverse interests. And that quote I said of the fellow masters in the US of not being serious about bringing dopers to cheaters to heel because it will damage sport. And there's a real vested interest sometimes. You've got to have the regulators set apart where they can do their job without, fear and favour.
Does it make a difference to you, Leo, where the money would be coming from, or do you simply take it on what you're getting from any organisation?
I think it should be church and state. There should be that independence of funding to take away any perception of influence. I think that's really important, especially in that area where I think the regulator needs to be seen to be totally independent, obviously answerable in hierarchy, but in terms of funding, I think it's really important that there's that clear area in that space.
Perhaps harder for international federations to have government funding contributed from across the piece, and I think, Brett, your case study shows that.
Yeah, so if we were relying on government funding, we'd have no funding. And racing is pretty unique in having the opportunity for government funding or quite heavy government relations in all. Not government relations, government regulation for all sports. So church and state is a good analogy. So in our case, the funding comes from the sport of athletics. It has to, because they're the only ones who are going to bother. But where we have the separation is a clear separation of powers in the Constitution. And it's the same as the Constitution. You think of a country, the police force in UK is going to be funded by the UK people and Parliament, not by the French. They couldn't care less. But there's a constitutional or legislative separation that ensures the police can act independently in terms of prosecuting cases, etc. So I think that's a good model.
Okay, it's moving us towards the sort of the international perspective, which is helpful for what we have here. And a couple of the questions relate directly to that. I'm going to lump them together. Here's one point. FIFA, as an example, has global rules. Harmonisation of rule has advanced greatly. With the diversity of facets, whether it's surfaces, goals as well, the rules of the game. So what needs to be done to truly regulate globally? And just picking up on that theme, I think there's another one here which emphasises that point as well. Well, it is there somewhere, but you get the point. In racing terms, how can you create a sort of harmonized rules body and therefore integrity regime that could ever work?
Can I just answer that, David, in saying I think the world has come a little closer. The protest rules, and Kim Kelly has been a driver of that. That's a good indication because, Leo, nothing annoys the punter sitting in the pub more if he's betting and there's the UK race, there's a French race, there's a US race, and all of a sudden a horse is demoted for what an Australian punter would think a very piffling reason. So I think in some ways, I don't know that we'll ever come completely together. The one that I think probably sticks out as a bit of a sore is therapeutic medications, and welfare is pushing, I think, the countries or country that still hangs on to that, that's pushing them in a direction of the rest of the world. I'll be happy to compare our track record with FIFA, though, at the end of the day.
Yeah, you can pick another example if you like, but I think the point nonetheless is a fair one, isn't it? That if you want to globalize racing, and we've talked a lot about commingling as well, if you want that sense of one international family looking at racing, you can't have different rules left, right and centre. And I just wonder if that sort of regulatory cart is way behind the more commercialised business of trying to internationalise racing.
Yeah, well, it depends on how fundamental the rule is. The example I give you is off the top of my head of therapeutic substances, one that I'd jump straight on if I were you and asking the question. But some of the other subtleties of difference, playing to the broader audience and the punter who likes to have a bet, they're not terribly interested in the time that the jockeys are put on or the fields are declared or a whole myriad of other little things that put the races together. It's the big ticket items that the punter wants to know he's on a level playing field, as they say.
Brett, you've worked in racing, you've worked in AFL, you're in World Athletics now. Can you see how racing could manage a sort of more common rules and therefore more single entity view on integrity and rules around that?
Well, I could certainly see the benefit of it. As to seeing it happen, that's another story. I think an interesting thing about racing in most jurisdictions is the regulators cover the absolute pinnacle of racing to the very lowly, almost hobby, well, not almost hobby, really hobby style of racing as well. And that's a really big barrier to kind of internationalisation, I think. Athletics, World Athletics is a different story. Our focus is very much the top, in my team, the top 500 or so athletes in the world. So I can see the benefit, but that structure of racing regulation would make it tough to achieve.
Okay.
But there's no
Anna-Marie.
reason why we couldn't have harmonisation of regulation across the very sort of premier events where we have a lot of international movement of animals and jockeys and trainers and everything else, because that would make life much easier, particularly around medication. I think that's got to be the key thing. But I think what's also really important is whatever underpins that integrity. So we have to have some really fair basic principles around how inquiries are held, how investigations are held, how sanctions are done, so that there can be mutual recognition of those sanctions at that level. And that's one of probably the most difficult bits, is to fit that into some sort of fair justice that goes globally across the sport.
Ray, that makes a huge amount of sense to me. Realistically, I mean, can you see that feasibly?
Look, in some of the places that Anna-Marie is talking about, in my view, the horsemen probably have too big a say, and that's the hurdle you're going to run into changing it. to me, it sounds terribly logical, but if I'm sitting over there in the administrator's shoes and he's going to get voted out at the next election, he probably sees it a different way. It's not going to be a simple process, but you look at what's happened around the world, and I instance the protest rules with Japan and Louis sitting there with France, and when I first sat around these conferences and stewards' conferences, we were a mile away from ever getting that. But, you know, you've got to keep chipping away. It's not going to happen overnight. But again, I'd be positive about it. And particularly with welfare now being a favourite buzzword, that might bring about change that otherwise would have taken forever or never, as Brett said.
But I mean, your language is very positive. Your demeanour is slightly less positive. In as much as, yeah, that would be a good thing. I can't see it happening anytime soon.
I'm older than you. You can't afford in international relationships to thrust down the throat of someone a view that you think is logical. It takes some manoeuvring, and I haven't wearied of it, David, but I've learned from it, and I'm not going to give you a view that all of a sudden we leave this wonderful country of South Africa and all's going to be harmonious in the world of racing.
No, I didn't expect you to do that. Ray, thank you. I want to ask another question here. We said very early on, of course, betting and horse racing have always gone hand in hand, and I think it's true. It is still seen as the sport where you bet. That's a big part is why you go in many countries, of course. So a question here, which is, how can the gambling regulators work better with sports integrity units to limit risk in gambling and betting? Brad?
Well, I think racing and Australia are really great examples of very good, well-regulated betting regimes that work well with the sport. First of all, you know, I'm a big believer in regulation, not prohibition. So having as a condition of a regulated market the sharing of information with stewards and with integrity departments is crucial. The illegal betting market makes that obviously a lot more difficult. And so that's the thing, sport by sport, that really has to be addressed and focused on according to the risk of the sport. So I know, for example, Hong Kong Jockey Club do a fantastic amount of work in actually trying to figure out the illegal betting market. The reforms in Australia that Ray was part of putting in place are really, in large part, focused on how can we actually manage the risk from illegal betting as well. So it's a horses for courses, depending, pardon the pun, lame pun, depending on the circumstances.
You don't have ownership of that pun. I've heard it a few times in the course of 2 days already. Leo, where do you look at, again, we're talking perceptions to a certain extent, if you've got the betting industry trying to help the integrity unit to improve a situation, is that perceived generally with scepticism and cynicism or positivism?
I think it's positive, where there are understandings, memorandum of understanding, and there's a flow of information from the betting companies to the regulator, and that information is shown to be decent and of good quality, and it helps the regulator do their job. I think it's a good thing, and if the gambling organisations are getting a good slice out of racing, that there's obviously an obligation to help racing or other sports to remain credible and clean. And I think we've seen that in Australia and in other parts of the world, and I think it's an obvious partnership.
Is the current climate, growth, expansion of betting and the way it is perceived nonetheless in many countries, I mean, people are getting more and more worried about the power of gambling and what it's doing to society. Is that bringing down racing's credibility and when we talk about integrity? Jack, you were nodding there.
Yeah, there is a huge emphasis, and particularly in the UK on this, the link between gambling and sport. So, for example, I think it's about half of the English Premier League teams are sponsored by gambling companies on their shirts. And there's a big, but I think with racing there is an acceptance that this is an old commercial reality, you know, so it doesn't impact as much in that sense, which is a kind of a weird dynamic. But definitely with gambling regulators, betting operators, sharing information in a secure environment with sport is the key to dealing with this, because I think we're going to hear soon about illegal betting. And remember, illegal betting is a fraud on all aspects of sport, from the consumers who watch it to the people who try and play it fairly. So that's a big point. And just the last point is we have to be careful a bit here about grand solutions as well. Australia's a very well-off country, has excellent integrity issues, but not all countries are as resourced when it comes to the regulation of sport. Even in my own country, Ireland, we don't have a gambling regulator, which is extraordinary. More or less, we don't have one. So you have got to think about that first, those resourcing issues.
Anna-Marie?
I think it's really important that we work across nations actually to try and tackle this, because it's an issue for us globally as a sport. And one thing that we know is if we can put deterrents in, those people that want to manipulate the markets will go elsewhere. So if we start to close it down country by country, we're just pushing people into another jurisdiction. If we can try and act as a sport across the countries, we can push them out to other sports, you know, which is let's just get it out of racing, and you know that's what we should be aiming to do, and that's much more important than perceptions of, you know, we clearly need to work with the gambling industry on perceptions around gambling addiction and the harm it does. But I think cleaning up that act and making sure it's outside of racing, and then protecting racing and protecting our customers in racing is what we need to do. Because I think gambling in racing is different to some of the other types of gambling.
Well, one thing racing is well-resourced in many respects, and I think World Athletics has put forward a well-resourced program as well. How far can you go? And I appreciate we're not going to bring an end to everything that's unsavory in sport. That's not going to happen. But you can perhaps, and the message I've got over the course of this chat is, you can certainly take control, squeeze out the areas where the damage is being done, so that when things go wrong, they go wrong occasionally and you know what's happening. How far can that take you, do you think, Brett?
Yeah, I'm very positive, like Ray, about what can be achieved. I see in athletics, we've been in existence just 2.5 years, and I already think we're making a real change in terms of the level of cheating that's happened in the past. But I also see we've got a long way to go, but I'm really confident about where we can be in 5 years' time. I really think that the model of you can drastically reduce the amount of people who are willing to break the rules through your efforts to enforce, but also to drive really positive cultural change in the sport as well. You're never going to get rid of cheating completely. There, of course, is an irreducible minority of people who can't be discouraged from cheating, but there's a huge amount of improvement that we've got to go still.
Leo, you are a serious journalist, creating and developing and breaking very serious stories. I mean, you would know very well there are plenty of other approaches to journalism, and they're not all as Ray will also know very well, they're not all as thorough. Does racing have a fair point to say, well, look at the media, look what they're doing again? You know, that's not fair in the way they treat stories?
I think it depends on which part of the media you're looking at. I think mainstream racing media, they have a serious and genuine interest in the sport, and they have its welfare at heart.
But even they then have to follow up on your breaking story, don't they? They have to go out and get the next line, the next lead, and that's where their pressure comes in.
Sure, but I think that in terms of overall health of racing, that it's a better place now than it was 2 or 3 years ago. I'm talking about Australia here, because of what's happened. You talk to trainers who say, I can actually go to the races now. The horse is in the same condition it was in 2018, but I'm winning races now where I wasn't back then. That's got to be a good thing. And in terms of the way that's covered, I think that the number of trainers we have now winning races in Australia is really instructive, particularly Victoria, and that's a really good barometer to go off.
I was going to start around... Sorry, Ray, you wanted to say something?
I think a point that Anna-Marie made there, we sort of smoothed over, that's important from when we're talking about the funding of racing, and it's funded by betting, and someone used an expression on Tuesday of social licence. It's a problem that there's community changing attitudes to gambling, and in some ways, you know, the problem gambling issue has put gambling more on the nose than the tobacco industry, and it's something racing has got to be very, very mindful of. Australia took a position with respect to bookmaking firms advertising during the currency of sporting events and giving odds every few minutes and having personalities promoting betting during hours when young and vulnerable people. But I think it's one thing to all try to promote the funding base, but we've got to be very careful going forward that we're not breaching that social licence that's so tenuous.
Well, certainly, as we said, with betting is something fairly special to racing. I've got a question here which refers to something unique to racing. How does the presence of the horse impact as an additional element within integrity? Leo, you were just saying that you think things are much better in racing today than they were 2 or 3 years ago. You wouldn't have made that assumption based on what you'd have read in the papers in the last 12 months.
True.
And that's all about horse.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge for the sport, and I think sitting above all of that is trying to rebuild that connection between the human and the horse. And I think ultimately that's where racing's magic sits. And we have to be, with all those issues around welfare, they need to be addressed intelligently and patiently. It's not going to come quickly. And we've talked about having to try and find uniformity around regulation. With horse welfare, it sits right at the top of the tree. And we saw in Australia last year how damaging it can be when those accusations are put out there and what an impact that had. But that connection should be, you know, if it's not, it should be the #1 priority.
Yeah, we'll talk more about equine welfare, of course, as you know, on the programme tomorrow. We're pretty short on time, so I want to whip along the line if I can, please. I get a sense that you do feel genuinely there are real strides made in a fight against cheating, in a bolstering of integrity within racing, but within all sports. How do you then get everyone out there to recognise that and realise that? There's a time lag, isn't there?
There is a time lag, and it can be a slow process. But all you can do is convince the public that through your structures, through your transparency, you are dealing with these issues. But just one point is, instead of, sometimes we think of grand solutions, harmonization, you know, that with FIFA, for example, I play the same rules of soccer that Ronaldo plays, you know, which is true. But that's meaningless. When you get harmonization, when you look at something like the World Anti-Doping Agency, it's how it's implemented nationally and at the lower levels. It's a key thing. And I think that's where we have to start. And I think when it comes to integrity in sport, the cross-pollination, sports combining together with integrity units, sharing information, is actually the key.
And showing, presumably, Anna-Marie, showing how tough you can be.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think when we talk about harmonisation, we're not talking about sort of identical necessarily. Yeah. I think things don't have to be mirrored. But I do think that there is a recognition that we need to be closer and work more closely together. But there's a reluctance for people to want to change the way that they behave things and do things. And what we need to be mindful of is that we don't want to wait until we've got the burning bridge. Yeah. You know, we know we need to do things. Let's try and put in timelines and steps and slowly work in that right direction so that we don't wait until we're at crisis point as a sport.
Yes, who prepares for a crisis? Not enough people. Brett?
What's the question? I'm sorry.
Well, it's give me a last thought, really, but I do get this sense that you all believe things are improving. Integrity issues are clearly, you would see them much higher up the list now.
Yeah.
But I don't think people out there think,
yes.
oh yeah, racing's a much cleaner sport these days, or any other sport.
It's a really, really interesting challenge, and we're going through it now, being a new unit of this lag you talk about. We're doing a great job. It's recognised in some circles, but in others see negative headlines for athletics when we have a case. So I think we have to be patient. Our first job is to convince world athletics and the people within athletics that this is the right long-term approach. If we don't do anything, we're heading towards what cycling was like in the 2000s, what Major League Baseball's been like, and etc. So I'm positive we'll get there. And really, an important strategy is proactive communications, as Jack said.
When do we get a headline, Leo? Racing, king of clean. I mean,
It's a nice thought. It's a slow burn, but I think it'll get there. And the key messages have to be out there, reinforced with the right kind of behaviours, and that all goes back to integrity and the knowledge out there that the sport is cleaning itself and has done a really good job. And once people grasp that, I think that's when the big gains will be made.
Ray, last word.
Yeah, well, look, I don't shy away that some of the matters Leo's alluding to have given racing in the last couple of years a black eye, but you can't broad brush the whole industry. Small pocket of people, not the vast majority, and I really think that the punter wants to know that there's a stewards force, and Terry Bailey's here, that his crew did a marvellous job and in getting to the bottom of it all, and you move on. Because the police force report every year that crime's coming down because they didn't catch anyone is hardly very heartening, So I don't see it as a doom and gloom situation of Victoria or New South Wales or Australia. I think there's a lot of confidence in the control and the conduct of racing in those jurisdictions.
I think that's a positive message to end on. I think it's also true, scrutiny has never been higher than it is today, and it will probably be higher tomorrow. But we've got to end the panel session there. So, ladies and gentlemen, could I ask you to thank our panel? Thank you very much indeed.